Hello human geographers, we are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we are looking at the locational theory for the primary sector. In other words, we are looking at a theory for where agricultural activities will locate. The model that explains this is named for the farmer who created it, Johann Heinrich von Thunen. We'll simply define this as the von Thunen model, which is a model that explains the location of agricultural activities in a commercial, profit-making economy. A process of spatial competition allocates various farming activities into rings around a central market city, with profit-earning capability the determining force in how far a crop locates from market. Now that we've identified the important pieces of this definition, let's take a closer look at the details. In 1826, von Thunen noticed that as one moved away from the town, one commodity or crop gave way to another without any visible change in soil, climate, or terrain. So let's look at what he noticed. In the first ring, there was horticulture or market gardening as well as dairying. These were highly perishable crops such as tomatoes, strawberries, and milk. These activities were intensive, high levels of output per acre of land. Vegetables and milk commanded higher prices because of their perishability and because they were difficult to transport. In the second ring was lumber, which was used as a fuel and a building material, making it an extremely important resource in 1826. While perishability isn't a concern, lumber is heavy and bulky, therefore significantly increasing the transportation costs, which then required it to be closer to the market. By the third ring, crops such as wheat, corn, and other grain crops were grown. These crops are more extensive, thus providing lower revenue per acre of land. In addition, they're less bulky and easier to transport without risk of perishing en route. Finally, the fourth ring is where the livestock are found. This land can be used for grazing by cows, sheep, goats, and other animals. The livestock could walk to market, and the only cost would be paying herdsmen, thereby minimizing transportation costs. And while meat is perishable, and this was a significant concern in 1826, spoilage could be avoided if the animals were walked to market and then slaughtered there. So the grazing land was far away, but the slaughterhouses were close to urban markets. It's important to note that the extensive nature of grain and livestock farming meant that those farms produced less revenue per parcel or per acre of land, and as a result were larger than those located in the inner rings of the model. So how did von Thunen come up with this model, and why does it operate this way? He knew that farmers wanted to maximize their profit, and with only a single market, there must be a reason to explain why farmers would grow a certain crop in a certain position relative to that market. Essentially, this model explains the influence of distance from market and the influence of transportation cost on the type and intensity of agriculture. So let's start with transportation costs. Von Thunen argued that these costs were proportional to the distance from the market. Essentially, with greater distance from market, transportation costs were higher. Those transport costs would then govern how the land was used. It's important to note at this point that distance decay is a major component of this model. As distance increased from the market, several notable elements decline. The intensity of the land use declines, the perishability of the crops decline, and the value of the land declines. So now we need to explain why the value of the land declines and how that impacts the crop choices, since that was what von Thunen noticed in the first place. So let's revisit the bid-rent theory. Remember this one? The idea that land that is more accessible is more expensive. Therefore, farmers who were closer to the city must use that land more intensively. But as distance increases, the price of land decreases because it's less accessible, meaning that more extensive crops, which didn't yield as much per acre, could be profitable. So, for example, at this point, lumber has declined in profitability because it is too far from the city and the transportation costs are too high, that it becomes more profitable to switch to the more extensive, less perishable grain crops, which have lower transport costs. And because this land is farther from the market, making it less accessible, this land is less valuable and therefore cheaper. So a farmer can buy more land to grow extensive grain crops and still turn a profit. Von Thunen's model was the first economic location model and provided the basis for later models on the secondary and tertiary sectors. But like all models, it needs to be adapted to actual conditions and changes in technology. And the real world is far more complicated. So let's start by assuming that the land isn't completely flat or featureless. And imagine that a river flows through the plain. That would make transportation easier and cheaper along the river, and the zones would stretch out along the river. As countries industrialized, there were improvements in technology. Due to improvements in refrigeration and transportation systems, strawberries and milk can be produced farther from the market than in von Thunen's time, a good example of space-time compression. But relative locations remain the same. They are still produced closer to the market than are grains and livestock. So let's bring this a little closer to reality. Our map of the United States shows similar rings to our von Thunen model. Forestry is the outlier, with the far western part of the country as the source of forest products. And wood has been replaced by oil, natural gas, and electricity as a fuel for heating homes, so forests are rarely located near communities today. Now, in fact, forested land that is at a city's edge is probably highly valuable as green space, such as parks. Our second U.S. map factors in another element that we know impacts agriculture: climate. We know that climate type and soil quality weigh heavily in the kinds of goods that are produced. Areas with better climates or more fertile soil have a comparative advantage or a naturally occurring beneficial condition for certain crops. There is not a lot of change in the zone designated for market gardening, but dairying has shifted to the north and west. Corn and soybeans extend eastward to the coast. A much larger area in the United States is shown for livestock ranching, and there's the addition of specialty crops like oranges in Florida and Mediterranean agriculture in California, which are heavily tied to the climate of the region. Another example that a lot of geographers use when talking about von Thunen is Uruguay. Uruguay is largely a plain area dominated by a single city, Montevideo. Similar to von Thunen's original premise, Montevideo is the capital city and is also a port. Notice that the prediction based on von Thunen's model is very similar to the reality of agriculture in Uruguay. One noticeable difference is that grain farming extends much farther north due to the Uruguay River. But after we look at these applications and examples, there are a few notes I want to leave you with. No model accounts for every variation that occurs in practice. For example, the United States has more than just New York City as a market, which is also the case for most countries. But this model is useful for studying the regional distribution of types of commercial agriculture. Von Thunen's underlying concern about the relationship between land use and transportation cost still explains many agricultural patterns. Though improvements in transportation technology has reduced the applicability of the model, the focus on maximizing profits for commercial farmers is just as relevant now as it was in 1826. That's all for tonight, everyone. I'll see you back in class.